Good morning, everyone. Nothing like following a video game when you've got to present. So for the next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about online classifieds. Just to give you some context about how we're going to approach it. Everyone would know online classifieds, right? It's one of the oldest, most successful business models online. It's worked everywhere. We've been involved in online classifieds for a long time. And something we've noticed just recently is just this evolution in classifieds. So for the past 20 years, this model has stayed pretty much the same. Our business at Frontier, we focus on online classifieds in frontier and emerging markets. So we've been in classifieds for a long time ourselves, in fact, back to 1999. About 5 years ago, we started looking at this really robust business model, and we started investing in it in more countries around the world. So over the past 3 years, our footprint around the globe now goes through Central America, Africa, South Asia, and parts of North Africa. So we really like investing in these online classifieds businesses. We're a little bit different in that we don't own them or operate them. We primarily look for entrepreneurs, many of whom are here today. So we look for entrepreneurs who are running online classifieds businesses in frontier and emerging markets. Our job is to provide them with a bit of funding, a bit of strategy, a bit of help, and we let them run the business. So we don't go into Sri Lanka or Morocco or Ghana, for example, and buy these businesses. We simply find good entrepreneurs and we help them run them. In fact, Abdurazak, second row, is from Morocco today and Watea.com, so welcome, Abdurazak. Little bit about our journey over the last couple of years, and then I'll get into the evolution of this business model. So we've been around 3 years. We have 15 partners around the globe. We started here in Mid-Valley, or in KL. We started with 1-2 people. We now have our own office. We listed on the ASX last year. So we're very active in the space. In terms of some of our highlights, the first investment we ever did in these frontier markets in online classifieds was in Pakistan, was in a business called Zameen. We did that 3.5 years ago. So that was what launched Frontier. That was what gave us the idea to go look in markets like Pakistan for online classifieds and find local entrepreneurs and invest in them. So that business is now valued at around $100 million US. It's been around for about 5 years. It's run really well. We own 30% of it, and we continue to help those guys run that business. And that's essentially what we do in other parts of the world. Our management team is made up of people from online classifieds, so iProperty, iCar, etc. I spent 8 years at REA, 5 years at iProperty, and was on the board of iCar for 4 years. So that's us. So we like online classifieds. Now, one of the reasons we like online classifieds is because I'd argue that it's probably been the most robust, profitable business model online in every country that it's been tried. There aren't too many internet business models that work everywhere. Online classifieds works everywhere. It's been really successful, and in fact, in terms of its success, if you think about the really big property portals around the world, Rightmove in the UK, Sellagere in France, realestate.com in Australia, these guys were up and about in the mid-90s. So they launched in 95. I think Rightmove launched in 94. Realestate.com was 95 or 96. They've been around for 20 plus years now. So these are really old internet businesses in terms of what we know today. And the reason they're so good is because this business model is so good. It's so profitable and has remained largely unchanged. It's when something works really well, not a lot of motivation to change. And the big reason it works well is because these companies are extremely profitable and extremely successful. And a big part of that is in developed countries where online classifieds is so profitable is that you've got really deep GDP, which means you've got a lot of ads being bought by consumers. So when these businesses evolved back in the early part of the last decade, their job was simply to shift print to online. It wasn't revolutionary as much as it was evolutionary. It wasn't disruptive as much as it was just making the experience better. So you had billions of dollars in print, which simply, well, not simply, with a bit of hard work, shifted to online into these classifieds businesses, and they've worked really, really well. Now, it doesn't go on forever. So for the first time in 20 years, we're now seeing this online classifieds business model evolve. And we're seeing it evolve in some interesting ways. Now, if you look at, this is property portals. So when you buy or sell a house, you kind of move left to right. These are all the different things that an online property portal can try and tap into to make money. Now, the big one that everyone has always made a lot of money is of course this one, property advertising. That's the simplest, it's the biggest. A company like Rightmove in the UK, their strategy is very simple. It's got 3 lines to it. We sell ads to agents in the UK and we give all the profits back to shareholders. That's their strategy, and they've done that really well. We've seen other companies like Zillow in the US, Zoopla in the UK, start to look at things like mortgages. With Zoopla, you can book your move, so you can get them to help you move. You get low-cost options like Purple Bricks, which is in the UK and Australia, about to go into the US. Redfin has been in the US for a long time. These guys are all trying to find ways to say, we've captured all the ad dollars, what else? How else can we continue to make money? And you're seeing this sort of innovation, I guess, in this very traditional business model in a lot of frontier and emerging markets. So the innovation around this is not just in developed countries. And these are all of our partners. So these are all of our partners in frontier and emerging markets who are also doing home services, doing valuation data. And Daham is here today, who runs Lanka Property Web. They've got an amazing database, probably the biggest database in Sri Lanka of sold property data, so they know valuation data. Right through to property management. Our partners in Nigeria provide online apps to manage your property portfolio. So a lot of this is innovating more so in these markets than in developed countries, and it's being done by necessity. Now, we know that in frontier and emerging markets, the ad dollar is smaller. So if you want to run a property portal, you actually have to find different ways to make money. So where is all this leading us? We all know that the holy grail, in a sense, is probably no longer advertising. Advertising is becoming a platform upon which you can then go after what we think is the big economic prize in the online property space, which is the transaction. So if you think about when you buy or sell a house, the person who gets paid the most, or the biggest economic event, is the commission. It's not the ads, it's not your moving, it's not your insurance, it's the commission that the person selling the property gets. And that, we know, is somewhere between 7 to 12 times in economic terms of ad dollars. So, and then if you think about where this works, it has to work, it's in these lower GDP markets because the ad pool is not as big. So if you want to run a good business, you actually have to say to yourself, right, I run an online classifieds portal, I need to get every property from every agent, have every consumer, but I need to do more. That becomes a platform to these frontier and emerging markets going after the transaction data. So what we see now is this box here, the transaction space, is where all of the focus is. So we now have 5 property partners in our portfolio who are not just selling ads, but primarily participating in the transaction and getting paid commission when a property sells. So it's no longer just about an ad, it's about a transaction, and it's getting paid at this point. In markets like Congo, for example, and the guys are here today, Didier and Christian, just down here, correct me if I'm wrong, but these guys have been involved in charging people to do an inspection. So right from the point at which you look at the house, they're finding more and more ways to monetize this value chain, but it has all come down to getting into the transaction. Now, there's a reason why this works in frontier markets and it doesn't really work in developed countries. So if I think about Australia or the US or the UK, you have very sophisticated industries, you've got a lot of regulation, you've got a lot of governance, you've got a lot of legislative protection when you buy a house or when you sell your house. So it's very hard for the portals to sort of go out of the advertising space and try and get into the transaction game because you've got a really sophisticated group of agents as well. Now, what we find is that the conditions that exist in these frontier markets are quite unique, and it allows property portals to be no longer just about selling ads, but about selling your house on their website and getting paid commission. Obviously, there are smaller ad markets, so they've actually got to find a new way to make money, and the transaction is the biggest prize. We know that there are relatively low levels of governance, which means that no one really trusts anyone. So in these markets, you have an absence of trust, and essentially the portals, as they become brands like Zameen in Pakistan, for example, they become like an intermediary, like a platform that people trust. So in the absence of legislation, governance, regulation, all of a sudden consumers say, well, I want to buy my house through your portal because I trust your portal. I don't trust anyone else. So the property seller says, well, if I'm going to sell properties, I've got to sell them through your portal because the consumers trust you, they don't trust me. So in these markets where there's a lack of regulation, lack of trust, all of a sudden the property portals find them in a space where they say, I'm not just going to sell ads, I'm actually going to start selling properties. Now we see this in markets, as I said, like Pakistan, in Myanmar, trialling it in Sri Lanka, in Nigeria, in Ghana, and we're now seeing this model evolve further where the newest property portals that are coming into the competitive markets are purely transactions. So they're saying, I'm not even going to bother selling ads. I'm not going to go down the classifieds path. I'm going to start with transactions. And these are the sorts of the businesses that we look at. And at the end of the day, if you look at what's happening in these markets, we know in Myanmar, which is 55 million people, the number one property portal there makes 65% of its revenue now from purely commissions and transactions. So it's no longer from ads, it's from commissions and transactions. Why? Because they're the leading portal, everyone trusts them, and they can provide that sense of trust and being an intermediary for the buyer and the seller, and they can charge, and people don't mind paying. So we're seeing this in frontier markets. In emerging markets, which is, places like Philippines, Vietnam, slightly different circumstance where they've continued to follow the online classifieds model, where you've got a lot of property portals who are fighting it out for the holy grail of advertising because it's worked so well in developed countries. But unfortunately in emerging markets, the ad pool again is not that big. So it's very difficult for these property portals to make money in emerging markets because the pool is just not that big. They're relatively sophisticated markets though. You've seen the mobile stats that drive these markets. So you've got consumers who are sophisticated, you've got pretty sophisticated sellers. So these are not, these are not simple markets. They've followed the UK, they've followed the US, they've followed Australia in rolling these businesses out. But they've found that it gets harder because the ad market's not that deep. So what you end up seeing is, as I mentioned before, the type of businesses we're looking at now are those who are going into emerging markets purely doing transactions. So if you go back 15 years when I was at REA and we were running it, and agents would say, are you ever going to displace agents? The answer was always no. We're going to help you. And the answer is still no. We're still going to help you. But this pendulum has moved to the point where unless you're thinking about running a property portal in frontier and emerging markets and doing transactions, you're going to find it really, really difficult. And this is a great contrast to what we're seeing in developed markets. Interesting in emerging markets, where you've got an existing ecosystem, you've got a lot of agents who have been trained on how to use the internet, you've got consumers who use the internet to look for property. So these are really fertile ground for really smart entrepreneurs who want to come in and say, I'm not going to go and have the race to the bottom and sell ads. I'm going to go straight to the sweet spot, which is transactions. And if you step back and think, well, this online classifieds business model that's been so successful for so long and so profitable and is not really needed to change is, I think, for the first time seeing structural, fundamental change in how these businesses operate. And interestingly, it's happening in markets, in frontier and emerging markets, where you probably wouldn't expect to see it, but it's being driven by necessity, and it's being driven in markets where it can actually work, and in markets where consumers want it to work, and advertisers are asking portals to do it. So, having been in classifieds for a very long time, it's an exciting period for us in that we've always been very focused on ads and those ancillary services like mortgages and moving. But if you think about what's happening in these markets in which we operate, the online classifieds world has fundamentally changed, it's fundamentally shifted, and it's not going back, and it's going to be about transactions. And the businesses that we invest in, if you look on this screen, there's 15 of them. I think 10 of them now have got revenue streams around transactions, not just in property, but in auto. And I'd say the genie is very much out of the bottle. So when you think about classifieds, think about these kind of markets if you want to see some really innovative entrepreneurs going past ads and now doing most of their revenue from transactions, which is a pretty cool thing. So that's my 15 minutes. Thank you on behalf of Frontier, and we'll see you next time.